Thank you so much for being here, especially on a rainy day. I know how sensitive Washingtonians are to the weather, so I really appreciate it. Being from Chicago, I'm impressed. If you can find a seat, please do. Otherwise, you can sit in this room over here. I want to thank you very much for being here. And I want to welcome everyone in the room to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And also, I want to welcome the live stream audience. Thank you for joining us. I'm Patricia Langen. I'm with Save the Children, and I'm the co-director of this event, the Evidence to Action Forum, The Future of Work for Deprived Youth. I'm also the director of the flagship youth employment program in urban areas for Save the Children called Skills to Succeed. And first, I'd like to go through some housekeeping. To repeat, we are being live streamed, so please take that into consideration. Also, please be considerate of your fellow audience members, and if you are asking a question or making a comment, please keep it brief. And please also identify yourself with your name and your organization. Your agenda is in your folders, and we aim to end by 12:20 p.m. We'll have a break of about 15 minutes at 10:05, okay? So I'd like to introduce David Barth, who is Save the Children's new Vice President for International Programs, to open the event. David comes to Save the Children from the Ford Foundation, where he directed their Global Grants program, and he also directed their Youth Opportunity and Learning area. David has worked on issues that we'll discuss today, including youth employment, education, women's rights, youth leadership, and adolescent development science. Before joining Ford, he was with USAID for 20-plus years, I think, in positions too numerous to mention, but I will mention that he was education director, regional director, mission director, and deputy chief of staff to the administrator. So Save the Children is really, really thrilled to have him as our new vice president for international programs, and I'd like to welcome David to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Patricia, and I am just thrilled to see you all here, and those I can't see, I'm thrilled that you're undoubtedly listening in. Yeah, I am new to Save the Children, and it's awfully exciting for me. The reason why I was attracted to Save the Children is because it's an organization, even though it's got children in the name, really sees the life course from infancy, childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, into adulthood and family formation as a continuum, and one that is governed by the intersection of many systems that create pathways and create barriers, and is committed to really understanding that. And it's an organization that tries to understand that through research. Sometimes it's research we do, often it's research you do, but it's the foundation of our objective to try and reach the most marginalized, the most deprived. And within that, we only function when we collaborate, and that's very much what today is about. And so that's a particularly important reason for all of us to be here. The absent collaboration, obviously, the research sits on the shelf. The program is ineffective because it's not well informed. The fact that you guys are here and not on the Excella going to New York is great. I know that we've all got our minds on a lot of activity in New York City that's going to be focused around youth this week, and that's a great thing. It's a great thing. And on the occasion of that, we're delighted to announce that we are going to join, Save the Children will join the Decent Jobs for Youth initiative. And that's an important coalition of stakeholders between research and practitioners. So collaboration is really important, and partnership is enormously important. And over the 100 years Save the Children has been working, among the most important and significant partnerships has been our 30-year partnership with Accenture. And we're happy to celebrate that partnership. It's been one that's allowed us to reach tens of thousands of young people in many different places. And we're thrilled because we get to announce today that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has selected our program together as a finalist for the Best Economic Empowerment Program. So that's exciting. As a critical partner, it's a particular pleasure for me to get to introduce Heidi Strawson from Accenture. to help kick off the event. Heidi's part of the global citizenship team at Accenture. She leads the Global Giving Program, managing a very rich portfolio, which we'll hear about. And prior to this role, you were in the organizational change group at Accenture and has been working in this field for many, many years. Heidi, would you come on up?
Okay, thanks very much, David. Thanks, Patricia. It's a great privilege to be in the room with so many experts, thought leaders, people contributing to those insights and learnings around youth economic empowerment today. To get one thing out the way, I've flown in from London. Somebody suggested that I had actually brought the weather with me, so I don't want to be so egocentric as to claim that, but it's possible, so sorry about that. At Accenture, we set a goal to equip 3 million people with the skills to get a job or start a business. And when we set that goal, it was very much driven out of our corporate citizenship interests as a global company. And born from that mission was our collaboration with Save the Children, which I think spans some 10 years or so now. I think when we first embarked on that mission, we did not fully appreciate quite how compelling a business agenda it would become for us as a company in terms of our own talent acquisition, for our clients and those who are interested in economic growth and a more equitable society. So it is a great privilege to be now standing here some 10 years on, looking back over the course of our collaboration with Save the Children. We have a partnership that is infused with, I think, a number of shared values, one of which being a compulsion to explore what is working, what can be replicated, what can be scaled, what makes the difference. We are very interested as a technology company in the role that technology plays in addressing some of the skills gaps and the needs of young people today, particularly those that are most marginalized. We're interested in the disruptor effect of technology and some of the opportunities that that provides. We're going to be talking a little bit later about the future of work, what sort of opportunities and challenges are going to open up. But we're also interested, we're interested in the skills that people need in order to thrive in a digital era. We're also fascinated in how you make those skills stick. And I think that is what I'm particularly excited about today. That's what's going to be opened up, some of the discussions and the debate, because I think there is an emerging body of insights into practice. We're contributing to some of those together with Save the Children. How those can be scaled and enabled across a global stage remains to be seen, and I know I'm talking to experts. Some of you are driving some of those insights and opportunities. So I'm really excited about today's discussion, sharing some of the evidence of what we've established works, and certainly exploring some of the open questions of the remaining dimensions that have yet to be addressed. So thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity, and looking forward to the rest of the session.
That's great. Thank you, Heidi. So we've decided to forego the traditional keynote address. Since we're talking about the relationship between research and practice, we thought we would have a keynote discussion. We said we should get a prominent researcher and a prominent practitioner up here. That would be really interesting. We didn't get just a prominent researcher and a prominent practitioner. We got some of the world's most prominent. And we're thrilled to have them both here and are looking forward to hearing what they elicit from that from a conversation. I'm not going to do long introductions. The introductions are in their bio. Suffice it to say that Dr. Abhijit Banerjee is a world-renowned researcher. He is the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at MIT, the co-founder of the Poverty Action Lab, and luckily for us, a member of the Save the Children board. You can read all of his prizes and fellowships and awards in the bio, but suffice it to say, he's on the high-level panel for the post-2015 development agenda under the Secretary General, and he's one of foreign policy's top 100 global thinkers. And one of the things that Dr. Banerjee always has focused on is the question of poverty traps, how to avoid them or how to escape them. Our practitioner, who's his foil on the dais today, is also concerned with poverty traps. He's the senior director at BRAC International, which has been named the top NGO in the world 3 years running now. That's pretty impressive. It's Asif Saleh. And Mr. Sala oversees dozens of aspects of BRAC's work, from advocacy and ICT and legal aid services and human rights. Before BRAC, you were in the corporate world, right? At Goldman Sachs and Glaxo Wellcome, Nortel. So we're thrilled to have you both. If that wasn't enough, we thought that we would add another superstar to the dais, and that's our moderator, who's Amanda Glassman. Many of you in this town know Amanda. She's the COO of the Center for Global Development, herself a prominent analyst, co-author of a number of books and papers. And so we are delighted to have the three of you, and I'd like to welcome you on up.
So this is very tightly choreographed, so I'm going to not spend time making much of a preamble. Thank you for organizing this amazing event, to the many partners who were involved in it, and thank you for having me here. What I wanted to do in the 8 minutes that I was assigned in this very carefully planned dance is talk about evidence. I thought that's setting the stage for the use of this very dangerous word. It may actually be a useful thing to do. So first, so I wanted to, as the title says, I want to have put forward 5 rules of thumb for evidence. And the first one I want to say is evidence, in all forms is important. That one shouldn't reify the word and therefore get intimidated by it. I think it's very important to think of it as being all of us keeping our eyes open, listening to whatever is there, and using all of that to make up our minds. That's absolutely important. Not all of it will be kind of board certified evidence. It's going to be what you find, and I think that's extremely important. And I think, to give you an example, the most telling fact is often the most basic. I remember this, we were working on immunization, why immunization rates, full immunization rates were 6% in this area where we were working in India. And we could debate all day on all the theories of that, except that we had missed one fact which was in the government's registers, which is that, so the debates were, people don't want to get immunized, there is just no way to get them immunized, it's impossible to do all kinds of debates, but there was one key fact that we had not noticed, which didn't require a randomized control trial to find out. It was that 83% of the people were getting their first shots, and 81% were getting their second shots. It's just their 5th shot that nobody was getting. So it has to be possible to get it, and people are willing to do it. And somehow the debates completely evaded this obvious part of the world fact. And as a result, we spend endless time going over various theories till I think somebody noticed this fact in the data, and then that changed the way we dealt with the problem. I'm going to skip forward. The second thing, which is the other side of it, is that while everything is possible evidence, I think it's very important to be skeptical. I think the most important thing that thinking about randomized control trials and proper methodologies does is it teaches us why evidence can be tricky. And I mean that at every level. I think the facts are often not facts. It's very easy to believe what you see, especially if it's what you want to see. And I think that's often a trap. We were worked with microcredit organizations for many years, and one of the things that kept coming back is they would tell us everybody wants it. Now, and the question we kept asking them is, who is everybody? How do you know that everybody wants it? And said, whenever we go there, everybody's very excited. And that was true, but when you actually measured it, it was more like 20% of the people wanted it than 100%. And that makes a huge difference, and it's the kind of thing that is very easy to sort of, you feel the excitement, and that's your evidence. And I think, so being skeptical, asking, how do I find out the answer to a question is key. It's thinking about sort of the steps to getting to that knowledge. And I think, in particular, I think what's really very tempting is sort of pseudo-evaluation. So in microcredit, there was lots of these, where people will tell us that, we met the beneficiaries. They were excited. As a very prominent investor in microcredit once told us, I have the anecdotes. I don't need the data. So I think when we did the impact evaluation, I mean, it was not true that there was any impact on people's earnings, and we now have done any number of these impact evaluations. I think there are 10 or 11 randomized controlled trials which find exactly the same thing. So I don't think there's any question that this was not increasing average income. But I think what was very clear is that these people who were saying it were not, I don't think they were dishonest. I think it's very tempting to sort of read the evidence as it is. For example, we looked at comparable people who didn't get microcredit. Now, you could take that as saying, yes, these are similar people, but you could also ask, why didn't those people get microcredit? If they're comparable, why didn't they get it? And if you start asking that question, you see why, in fact, you see no impact once you actually do the randomized control trial. And one advantage of doing randomized control trials is that it doesn't require thinking of every piece of what can go wrong. It's relatively straightforward, and that's maybe one excuse for insisting on the evidence from those. But this should be combined with what I said before, which is that let's not be ideological about the nature of evidence. Let's keep our eyes open. Okay. Third, imitate where you can. Don't innovate. I think this is absolutely anathema to almost every organization I work with. But I think it's the best way to use evidence is to be faithful to the original idea. Then you can use the evidence. If you constantly innovate, there is never a cumulative building of evidence, and therefore you're always, this is new, and I don't know what's going on. So sticking to the model is actually a very good way of getting to use evidence, and it's a hard thing to sell to organizations who all think that their idea is better, but it's one that I think helps a lot. When you are imitating, believe the details. Don't imitate and say, I did what they're doing and not do it. And that's very tempting. For example, BRAC has this wonderful graduation program where there's been lots of our cities which we've been involved in, and they have very strong positive results. Lots of people looked at that evidence and said, we are doing the same thing. And the key thing that they were doing is not just giving people assets. This was one part of it. But they were also giving people advice, help, hand-holding in using the assets. We did in our city where we took away the hand-holding, which didn't look so important. And as soon as you take it away, the effects go away. So it's really important to pay attention to the details. It's not just that I do what they're doing in spirit. It has to be in fact, in a sense. And finally, I should have one more slide. And finally, I think it's very important to recognize that however the number of researchers we engage in this, we're never going to answer all questions. So we have to have a way of generating the right questions so that what's important, we have to sort of take stock. There's no way of kind of covering the world with doing evaluations of everything and pinning everything down from that. You'll have to start by saying, this is a way of working through this world and identifying the question. So thinking, there's no substitute for thinking. There's no substitute for structuring when you look for evidence in a systematic way. Not try to say, well, whatever it is, we're going to do another evaluation. Try to think of why this evaluation is important. That's the way to generate evidence that's cumulative, that adds to itself, and that makes us all smarter. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhijit. I will start where he left off in terms of, from an implementer's perspective, why research is important to BRAC. So as I was thinking, I was walking along our stairwells. I have looked at this picture that stares at us. So zoom in. Basically, this is a picture about how important research is for BRAC's implementation. Talks about whether it's the quality control or whether it's the innovation. Research has been part of BRAC's DNA from the very, very beginning. So zoom in further. This is a picture of our founder, Sarfraz Hassan Abed, the then research director, and along with the director of education. Guess what they are doing? They were linking evidence to action. So that's, so basically, I think in terms of, what essentially, why we use research. I mean, it's very easy to get hung up in terms of the methodology and all that. But from an implementer's perspective, it's about asking the right question at the right time. But at the same time, when the answer comes in, and sometimes it's a very brutally honest answer, you need to be willing to use the answers to adopt your implementation. So that's how kind of we have utilized research in the past. So it actually, that's the aspiration that we do it for every single implementation, but it's not necessarily successful because not everybody has the appetite all the time. But in the cases where it has worked, it has actually created wonders. So I'm going to share 3 lessons from that where it really worked well, and particularly in the backdrop of Dr. Banerjee's presentation, talk about graduation program a little bit. So when meaningful insights that generated are from program, and it's actually linked with and validated with macro level research, a lot of interesting things can happen. And this is basically was particularly true for our graduation program. In the sort of mid to late 90s, there were 2 things happening in parallel in Bangladesh. On one hand, BRAC was actually working with the government on some of the social safety net programs in Food for Work program, particular vulnerable people. So that was going on one hand. On the other hand, microfinance was growing at scale across Bangladesh at the same time. So the programmatic insights, the data actually was quite interesting when the microfinance was growing at scale. At that time, also, if you remember that, those of who you were in the development sector, that microfinance was touted as the magic bullet for poverty, right? So it actually solves all your problems, and poverty would be in museum. But that actually, we saw in the data that didn't actually quite happen. That was one of the insights. This was what happened. So we said that there's one group of people who could not actually get the benefit of microfinance, but we couldn't quite figure out the profile of this group of people. So we initiated a nationwide research across the country, and what got validated was that yes, about 15 to 20% of the people who are so poor, who are so invisible in the society, that they cannot get the benefit of microfinance. So coupled with the work that we were doing for the social safety net programs with the government, that insight and the validation from the data and research that came in, basically we decided to start the Targeting the Ultra Poor program, and which eventually was called the graduation model. So that's how powerful research can be. And in terms of from the genesis of the program as well. The lesson number 2 has been how tightly coupled research agenda with the program can really benefit the program's rapid replication as well. From the program's genesis, the first research that happened in 2004 till 2013, there were about 23 working papers that was written by our research and evaluation division. And that ranged from simple things like process documentation to what are the contextual realities, what part of the program worked better when applied in certain contexts. All of those was documented. It was not until like about 7 to 8 years later we started to kind of recognize also the long-term impact of the program, how it helped, even after the two-year intervention finished, how it continued to help the ultra-poor. So that's when the long-term impact research actually started, so more quantitative research that started. So in 2006, something interesting happened, but by that time, word started leaking out that this is an interesting program that started to show some benefits. There was a guy named Dr. Hashmi who worked in CGAP, who basically said that we know that microfinance doesn't touch everybody, but BRAC has an interesting program in Bangladesh. Why don't we try that, imitate that across the different countries, and see if it works outside Bangladesh and without BRAC? So that, he went to and talked to Ford Foundation and CGAP. So that led to massive replication in 6 other countries in pilots that started, and it was coupled by a global research agenda where JPAL got involved in terms of looking at the actual impact, whether it's actually worked or not in other contexts. In 2015, the publication came out, and the answer was yes. I mean, it actually worked. And that basically then led to a lot of interesting replication in various, right now as we speak, we have about 100 different pilots going on in different contexts in 46 different countries. So there's an interesting story to be told here, where basically very simple local qualitative study which gave ideas about improving the program on one hand, then linked with also the quantitative studies to look at the actual impact. It wasn't until 2013 when the first results of RCT for BRAC's graduation program came out. And then coupled with the global agenda, which JPAL brought in, really created that body of evidence which gave a lot of confidence to governments and other organizations that here's a program that actually can work. So this is basically how do we take this lesson to the jobs agenda. I think that's basically goes to our lesson number 3. We started our first skills program in 2013 and understood that it's actually far more complicated a sector for young people. I mean, particularly in the context. There are so much other external variables that continues to shift, whether it's the local market situation, whether it's the changing nature of the job, whether it's the, and even within Bangladesh, different contexts, urbanization, rural markets. If we want to be demand-driven, if we want them to link them to the jobs, we need to understand that very well. We need to understand the context very well, and also the, even go into deeper every sector where I try to skill people. So there's a lot to unpack over there. And the one particular area where I see that there's a lack of understanding is we don't actually understand, we are people in the social sector, is that how enterprises work. What are the incentives for people to actually employ people, more skilled people? So that's also another interesting area. So we started the RCT, unlike graduation program, quite early in the program. And just to basically see whether, before we go into deep, whether this program has impact. And the program actually showed some very interesting results in terms of also social impact beyond just looking at the economic impact. As one example, the early marriage rate actually drops down dramatically in 62% cases for women, girls who were employed, who were working in that program. So, so now that we are here today, kind of setting the stage for the long-term plan for the youth agenda, I think the lessons are that there is a lot to be done. And I think in terms of particularly creating that body of evidence is very, very essential. Looking at what is working, what is not working, and understanding that, and going into deep, and then basically let the practitioners then take over and replicating the models that actually work, which happen in the case of extreme poverty. And also not just leave it at that, but continuously look at improving your own model as well, and continue to look at other innovations. But one thing we need to be very clear about, also we need to align the sort of incentives for researchers and practitioners as well. So hope we can talk a little bit about that in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Asif. So let's start where you ended on the issue of incentives. One thing that we see a lot in this field is there's a limited amount of evidence, but that evidence is not necessarily used in different places. You gave a very good tip, which is start with what we know works. Look at the details of what has worked, take it elsewhere. But let's look at the bigger picture. There are a lot of pilots in our field. There's a lot of smaller scale evaluations, but then we don't see some of that evidence generalize to the systematic actions of governments or donors, for example. What would you say about incentives that could increase the utilization of the evidence that we do have, and also create incentives to generate it further?
So I think I want to slightly amend the question, because I feel like the word incentive already loads onto one thing. And I often found that the incentive is not the problem. The problem is often more shoe leather. So when we go to governments and say, this is the evidence, the first reaction is not, why should I do that? But often, can you come here and help us do it? And we don't have the capacity to implement anything new. So I think one of the things that's absolutely central to, I think, Jayapal's experience on this is that if you can get some people, plant some people inside the government who do all the running around, a memo has to be generated to get this to this committee, then it's much more likely to happen. So one of the reasons why evidence does, I'm not saying it's the only reason, there are incentives and all those things, but just to make a point that I think is key, one of the ways in which you get evidence into it is just putting some muscle behind it. I think it's not a matter of just putting it out there and saying, here is knowledge, you take it. Partly the details point that I was making before is key, because if you don't do that, then people won't actually pay enough attention to it to know what to do, and then you get the wrong program. So all of that says that I think part of the investment that's missing right now is an investment in that layer of just people to do that job.
Yeah. So kind of advocacy and brokering for evidence and the use of evidence inside government.
Kind of mundane way.
Yeah. Let me ask you how well, so you've talked about how this is core to BRAC's mission and its founding. How much do external funders help you or reinforce this use of evidence and evaluation? I mean, you've talked about some very positive results from evaluation. What happens when you get not so positive results?
I think our funders have been very supportive in terms of asking some of the tougher questions and stuff. But I think I'm coming back to a specific to BRAC, but going back to what Dr. Banerjee said, the reason I put that in there, in the incentive-wise, I think one thing that happens in our sector quite a bit is that there's a plethora of pilots. Like you said, there's a lot of pilots going on. And when you actually talk to the funders and stuff, oftentimes most funders are interested about, okay, this is the number of people who you trained, how many are into the job market, and this is the, they're not interested in so much into the hows and whys of it. I mean, it's amazing to me sometimes that the same funder are funding 3 different entities, and they are not aligned with the strategy. And it's very, I mean, I would say it's just a matter of they have the convening power. It's very easy to do. So it's also easy to kind of align the research agenda, evidence agenda as well. But that doesn't happen. But I mean, I think oftentimes we get questions around, okay, so has the numbers been generated? So for example, in the skills sector, in the last 3-4 years of working, that we saw that it's actually what we promised to the funders in the first few years, based on the fact that things are going to go on a straight curve, that, okay, yeah, we want to do demand-driven skills training. We want to identify those portable skills, and we can train them, and we can link them to the market. But things are not as straightforward because the whole sector is quite messed up. I mean, in other words, because there are, when you look at, say, in Bangladesh's context, 80% of the market is in the informal sector. So when you promote more women to go to these sectors, what do you do when this sector is not regulated? I mean, can you ensure their safety? Then there are simply not enough assessors in the sector who can do that. A lot of government infrastructure, but so if we want to actually create an impact, then we need to actually look at the larger ecosystem and put those in place. So again, luckily we have a strategic partnership with our funders, so we could explain all that, look, I could give you the numbers, but it's actually not going to fix the things because we are looking at the larger situation.
Yeah, let me ask you then a connected question, which is that many times, a lot of these interventions are at the individual or the household level, but they interact obviously with a market that is operating under certain regulatory norms, labor market structures. How to find that balance between policy interventions that we should also evaluate? Can you refer to an experience that you've had where you're looking kind of at both pieces in the same location?
Yeah, in fact, there was a slide which I skipped, so this is great. The last slide, which I figured fell under the 8-minute cut, was there's an evaluation of youth programs, a very good example. There's tons of evaluations. There are more than 500. There was I think 3 years ago, there was a survey of these evaluations. There were 500 evaluations. Almost none of them asked the obvious question, which is what you're asking, which is these people, you do something to them, they get a job. Who doesn't get that job? Is the job empty, or are you improving matching? Are you just taking job from somebody else and giving it to this person? When there was an evaluation that was done, a randomized control trial, where what they did was they randomized it both at the individual level and at the community level. When you do it at the community level, basically, some communities, a lot of people are getting the training, and other communities, few people are getting the training, so the displacement is less. And when you do that, you see that almost all the effect came from, this is in France, but all the effect came from displacement. And that was but somehow, everybody was happy to see the pilot, exactly as Asif Bhai was saying, that you see the pilot, but interrogating it any further didn't serve their purpose somehow.
Yeah. Very good point. Let me ask you about the role of a non-governmental organization versus the role of a government or external funder. I mean, many times, BRAC is really an exception because you have this enormous scale. You operate yourselves almost as a government. But what would you say when you look at some of your counterpart organizations, no comment, right, elsewhere in the world, who might be smaller in scale? What is the exact role of NGOs in terms of generating evidence, piloting, and then what about that flight plan for after the pilot?
Yeah, I mean, I hope there's no government. I mean, I think that's an urban myth that BRAC is a government. So it's actually big, but in terms of the government, we are a lot smaller. But but in terms of for the smaller NGOs, I think nonprofits' role should be basically solving social problems. So coming up with social solutions that work, and particularly for us in a low constraint, low resource environment where we operate. So coming up with solutions that can be scaled. So of course do the pilot, but in certain cases, like why BRAC decided to scale so rapidly, and on all our programs we think scale, because in a lot of times government in these countries don't have the capacity as well. So and they want the help. Like that's what happened in Bangladesh in the education sector, health sector. Government said. And they didn't have any restriction. They were they were spending on their own, but they also knew that they had limitations. So there's like, okay, you do it, and that makes us look better, so that's fine. As long as you don't want the political glory, we are fine with that. So, but they also tried to understand, so how we could get some of these scale work in such a low cost. And so that's where I think NGOs have that ability to innovate. And because the government structure doesn't allow it, So then if you can do the proper advocacy around it, and we have some examples in the past, like how we did the pre-primary schools to increase enrollment. Once we did the model at scale, then we took to the government, and the government adopted that model. So, and then they scaled up. So then we said that, okay, now we can reduce our schools. So that's the ultimate thing. I think it's advocacy through demonstration.
I mean, and I think that's a really key point about, using the same unit costs as, say, the public sector has for a student or for a trainee. Can you say a little bit about evaluation of cost effectiveness, how that affects your dialogue with governments when you're talking about whether this is a relevant example for them? Because a lot of times we see, sort of high per unit costs of impact in smaller scale projects, but of course, if we scale up, it would change. But what do you say about that issue?
It's a hard one because you say this costs $30 per head, and they say we spend $3, and you have to convince them that 30 can turn into 3 if you do it right on scale, and sometimes it does create a credibility gap. That's why I think it's very important that we have organizations like BRAC, like Pratham, which operate on scale and who can implement programs in a sense before you take them to the government. I think that's actually very important. I think in a sense there is what I don't see very much, and I'll say that maybe Asif Bhai will correct me, I hope he does, is an adoption of programs from smaller NGOs who are potentially more nimble by bigger NGOs. It's something that should be happening because they are, in a sense, very good place to mediate. The Save the Children could mediate something. She could take something from a small NGO and just scale it up. And I don't see enough of that.
So we have 1 minute left, and I want to ask you, if you were speaking to your largest external funder, we won't name them, or if Save the Children were speaking to their largest external funder, what changes would you like to see to get the focus more on this evidence to scale, to sustain, that whole sort of chain that we've talked about today? What would you recommend to your funding partners?
Yeah, I think this is what Vijita said very big at the beginning. I think coming up with things that work and then agreeing on that, and then let's focus on scaling that up and contextualizing it. I would say that, let's agree on coming up with a longer term strategy and plan in terms of how we can do this. And we understand the nuances and the complexities, but there are certain basic things we also know. There are evidence for this. So let's come up with a overall strategy longer term. Graduation, it's been 17, 18 years, and only now it has started to take off. So it's going to take time, but let's come up with a plan that this is a long-term game, have patience, and let's come up with a strategy.
That sounds good. So can you also give your sort of advice to the funders in the room? And also thinking about this short-term, long-term piece. If it's 18 years, but we're measuring it 6 months, we're measuring it 12 months, and we're seeing effects change. What do you say about that?
First, I want to say amen to what he said. I think that's exactly. I think that the fact that that it's going to take 18 years doesn't mean that. In some sense, policy is never going to stop. So I think whatever we get, we feed in. And I think part of where I think the research community has been maybe too reluctant is to go back and feed in what it knows at this point. I think it's something that takes some, you have to be prepared to be wrong. I now make a presentation. We wrote a book some years ago called Poor Economics, and now I make a presentation which is about where did we get it wrong. And it's a useful exercise in going back and thinking, where did we predicted things and they were wrong. And I think it's hard. I think if we want to be right, we're going to always be too conservative. I think we have to be prepared to be wrong sometimes, and I think we aren't as willing, I think.
So we should take the portfolio approach. So I think with that, our time is up. Thank you very much for very interesting comments and a speech, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you so much. So now we're moving into our session on setting the stage. And I welcome my co-directors for this event, Sylvia Peruzzala and Chris Ying. to make a presentation. While they're making a presentation, we will literally be setting the stage. So sorry for the disturbance, but please go ahead.
Yeah. So good morning, everyone. My name is Silvia Paruzzola. I'm the co-director for the event and the deputy director for the Child Poverty Global Theme at Save the Children. I'm going to try to stick behind the podium. I'm not very good at it. And I'm going to try to keep this a bit light as you digest all the insights you just heard from this amazing discussion. And also, as Dr. Banerjee said, we really try to orchestrate every minute of this. So now we're also going to try to tell you what to think about for the next couple of hours. So again, we're setting the stage. You heard about evidence to action, but what else do we need to think about? We're going to talk about the future of work, but we want us all to be in the same frame of mind and think about the same populations. What do we mean by deprived youth? So beyond semantics, I know people in this room could spend hours talking about, is it deprived, is it opportunity youth, is it at risk, marginalized? We could go on forever. Let's not think about the words, but let's have all in mind the same populations and people we're gonna be talking about when we start talking about the evidence. So let's think about girls at risk of marriage in Bangladesh. We're gonna see an amazing study from a program there where thousands of girls actually gave us their time and answered our long surveys to help us understand how to better serve them, how to better work with them to make sure they can be empowered socially and economically, and that risk of them getting married too early can be reduced. We're gonna be talking about young boys, men and women in Uganda in a post-conflict setting, trying to make a living and finding themselves needing the skills to set up businesses. And we're gonna see what the short and long-term effects of another great evaluation tells us about them. We're gonna talk about girls and boys from rural areas that are far from services, dropped out of school, and have to find, again, opportunities to build a living. And they also have to live through gender barriers, community understanding of what their future will look like to really find a path to economic independence. Think about young people with disability. We don't have enough evidence. We have very little evidence for young people with disability, but we can think about what we've learned from other contexts and other populations to try to really understand what's the most cost-effective way to work with them. And think also about French college graduates. I mean, we have evidence, as Dr. Banerjee mentioned, and they also don't find jobs months and years after they've graduated. Maybe that's not the type of population we're thinking about at Save the Children, but we want to learn from those evaluations to serve the other populations we just talked about. We want you to keep focused. And so my friend Patricia told me that Supergirl has laser-focused eyes. So be focused. We can't tackle the whole field of youth employment and all the questions today. So we did a lot of work to try to craft a few key areas that we and a lot of you contributed to the thinking. It's been going on for a while. So we're setting the stage, as you can see. So we want to keep focused and try to really think about those areas. What have we learned? We have some evidence. Let's try to start taking stock of what we know. And also, obviously, try to get your common understanding to come up with what are the key unanswered questions. We can, again, address everything. So let's try to keep focused. Picking up on another point from Dr. Banerjee in the previous panel, let's focus on the question. Today, we're going to consider a rabbit hole if you start talking about methods, research methods. We know it's important, and here's a quote from a recent article that I really love. We really need to be very careful on which research method we use or evaluation method we use, and we know it's very, very important. But it's just not for today's conversation. Today's conversation is more about how do we interpret the evidence we have and what questions do we have unanswered. Finally, this is just the first step. As we heard before, we think that to build an evidence base, there's going to be need to craft a puzzle, and all the pieces of this puzzle need to come together. But today, we made an effort to bring you all here to select some topics, and we commit to writing a paper coming out of this meeting so that we can pick up on all your questions and insights into what we will hear from all the great panel discussions. But again, it's a first step, and we'll have to continue collaborating. So, I don't know if you can read it well, but I think this is a great quote. This is just the beginning. If we want to continue working together and building the evidence base, we'll have to continue collaborating. And again, building the evidence base is really building a puzzle. The picture won't become clear until we have all the different pieces, but we need to start knowing what our vision is and what our frame looks like to be able to do so. And thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of the day.
The stage is set. So we would like to begin by inviting our session 1 speakers to come up on stage. Session 1 is entitled, What Matters for Girls' Empowerment? Is it the bundle? And what we mean by this is we'll be exploring what works for girls' economic empowerment. Is it multi-pronged, bundled programs? As people get set up, for this session, on each table are Post-it notes and a bunch of pens. If you have questions for the presenters, please write them down and hold them up, and somebody will come by and pick them up. And towards the end of the session, we'll hand those questions to the moderator, and they will ask them of our discussants. I'd like to introduce, starting to my immediate right, Susana Puerto Gonzalez of the International Labor Organization, who will serve as our moderator for this session. Dr. Munchi Solomon of Save the Children. Dr. Andrea Melnekis of the Population Council, Dr. Erica Field of Duke University, and Danilo Rapier, CEO of BRAC USA. So we'll start out with a presentation from Dr. Suleiman. If you'd like to join us up here.
Thank you. Right, so I have about 10 minutes to talk about 6 different research pieces, so wish me luck. So this is about the bundled project. So all of them kind of fall in the bundled intervention structure. But it's not a systematic review. It's a very unsystematic review. So what I'm going to present is not necessarily representative of all bundled evaluations. So I want to make that clear up front. So having said that, when I look at these three distinct sets of interventions, that have been evaluated through 6 or 7 different studies, the summary is kind of 8 seconds long. I can just say everything works. When it comes to these adolescent girls, everything seems to be working. Now, let me give a bit of background of these 3 sets of intervention. So there is Kishori Kanto, which means girl's voice. In Bangla. So that's the Save the Children project in Bangladesh. It has been evaluated between 2007 and 2014. It's about 7 years of results, so not just short-term impacts. Then we have Balika, which means girls, again in Bangla. I feel really proud to be a Bangladeshi here. All 3 seems to be either in Bangladesh or studied in Bangladesh. So yeah, 2 seconds of being proud. Then the third, so the Balika is a design that has been tested by Population Council, and the evaluation was within looking at the 2 years of impact between 2013 and 15. And the last one, the ELA, Empowerment and Livelihood for Adolescents, that's something BRAC started in Bangladesh, but there has been a lot of adaptation and modification in Uganda, South Sudan, Sierra Leone, so in 4 African countries. And we have, so all of those are randomized control trial studies with different time frames. Now, this is the super sort of simplified summary of what works and doesn't work. So in the first program, if we look at the Kishori contour, the first one, the economic empowerment, we find positive impacts on income generating activity for adolescent girls in that Kishori contour for over 7 years. If we look at the other interventions, so the other outcomes, early marriage or early pregnancy, that differs based on whether it's Asia or Africa, different problems, health, social empowerment, and then education. So this is kind of the 4 areas of outcomes that are bundled as one intervention. Now, one thing that I kind of was trying to conceptualize why this bundle is different from, let's say, a vocational training where we add soft skills or some other trainings. I think all of these interventions, the model is kind of taking community as the center of the intervention. It's not necessarily the individuals. There is some sort of community social norm change that's also in the target. And these income generating activities or economic empowerment is kind of a secondary element of this whole empowerment. So there's social empowerment and economic empowerment, but it's primarily social, and then economic empowerment component is added. So, but this day is about economic empowerment, so we'll talk about it more than the other elements. But in this Kishori contest study, what was really interesting is there was an incentive for the parents in the form of in-kind transfer cooking oil, and that seemed to work really well in delaying marriage, although the empowerment element didn't work in Bangladesh. Balika is another project that kind of made me think like it is this whole idea of doing things with adolescent girls is intervention proof, because they tried 3 different models. So it was about 100 villages that were divided into 4 different treatment arms, and they find positive impacts of all 3 versions of the intervention, be it taking economic empowerment as the main angle or taking gender awareness or education. They find positive effect on all 3 of all 3 versions of this project. And then ELA, I have a couple of yellow marks just to have a reality check that it's always not green. This target group, these adolescent girls, they might be design proof, but our design is not implementation proof. We may falter in doing the implementation of the projects. If I can sort of go a bit tangent to bring in the graduation example, I mean, it worked overall and pretty much everywhere, but there was a reality check of a case of in Honduras where it didn't work, and there was a simple case of implementation failure. So for ELA, we also have a case like that. In Tanzania, there was a bit of implementation failure, but it was not because of lack of understanding, it was because of lack of resources. So sometimes, I mean, this ELA model, one more thing I would highlight is when it comes to scaling up, we are usually skeptical that when we scale up the design, there will be falter. It's better in pilot, not so good in scale up. Now, if I can bring in a little bit of my uncertified knowledge of seeing this program in the ground, this is one case where I found scale is of advantage for quality rather than the other way around. And we can talk about it more if we want in the discussion. Now, this is a bundle intervention. Overall, it works, but there's one element that seems to be at the core of all of this, which is the safe space for these adolescent girls. And this is one piece of evidence that I've sort of brought in from the Kishori contest study, but there are others, more qualitative as well, whereby we see the girls who live closer to this safe space, if it's a club, the changes are much bigger than if they're further away. And also, if I compare the ELA in Uganda and Tanzania, in Uganda, the clubs were sort of more spacious. It had more, it was nicer basically than the clubs in Tanzania, and that seemed to be making a big difference in the outcomes. Then there is a big element of such a social intervention sort of to keep interest going. So from Balika intervention, we see that the number of participants, people coming in, it keeps dropping. I mean, there are sort of some seasonal drops. So in this case, in December, there was a drop. That's primarily because the exam period. But usually, in these type of interventions, in these clubs, the girls coming in, the interests start to die down after a while. So that's why it's really critical to keep the incentives right. And bundling make it really interesting sort of package so that everyone has something to gain out of it. So if there is a sort of little supplementary education, girls who are in schools, they can get out of that. If there is income generating activity, the girls who are out of school, they gain something out of that. And then of course the recreation and activities, that's pretty much for everyone, hopefully. So that keeps these activities going. Finally, the sort of comparison between incentive for the parents versus the girls. When it comes to this type of social intervention, we also need to think about whether parents have enough incentive to send their daughters to these types of activities or these clubs. I think this is my last slide. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, good morning. My name is Susana Puerto. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I work for the International Labour Organization, and speaking of the laser eyes that Silvia mentioned before, we have a homework for you. So we are going to start the session by asking you, I believe you have some post-its on your tables, and we will ask you to write in those post-its some responses to the following question. What are the most important research questions that need to be answered in the next 3 to 5 years when it comes to girls' economic empowerment? So we heard from Monshi a number of different results, a number of questions answered or partially answered. So what is still missing? Where do we think we need to keep investing research time and our efforts answering key questions? What are those key questions? All right. So while I have you guys thinking about that and writing your questions, we will start the conversation with a very nice panel. And I'm actually going to start with Erika. I understand, Erika, you work in the Kishori evaluation. That's right. So, well, Munshi just talked about the bundle, but there might be cases where we don't have the ability to deliver a bundle, or there might be different specifications of a bundle. So the question is, when we speak about economic empowerment, when does economic empowerment kick in relation to social empowerment, how is the interaction and the causality, in a way, between those two impacts that we see coming from these types of interventions?
So our experience in evaluating the Kishori Kanta program was very interesting to us. Let me describe a little bit more of how we set up the evaluation, because I do think we learned something about the bundle, but a little bit different than the bundle than what she was describing. So we set up the evaluation to compare the standard empowerment program that's now being replicated in many settings with an incentive program. This was an in-kind transfer delivered to parents to compensate them for the costs of delaying marriage for their daughters. And we not only compared these two separate programs in different villages, but we also bundled those two programs to see if there was some interaction between targeting parents in this way and targeting girls directly. And the empowerment program, although there was some community mobilization, it was very much focused on the youth. The safe space was really designed to be a space where the youth could interact together without any outside influence, without community members coming in and observing them and distracting them. And I think that's important. I mean, that is something an aspect of these programs that in itself needs to be evaluated, but because it is a common component to most empowerment programs, but it was believed to be critical. But what that means is that the parents were never targeted directly in these empowerment programs, which is some of what we think of as the reason why in this setting, in South Asia, and not so much in other countries where adolescents have a little bit more agency over their reproductive outcomes, you don't have the outcomes that parents are really determining, which are marriage age and childbearing age, being affected by the empowerment program, whereas we do see all of the other bundled outcomes that were targeted by the program. We see changes in income generating activity and measures of knowledge and empowerment, of mobility inside the village and education. All the things that the other program focused on are improving, but not sometimes what we care most about and think of as the most empowering, which is child marriage. That was not affected by the empowerment program. On the other hand, we do know that there is room to move that without much of an influence by targeting parents with a very small incentive. And so we feel like we learned something about, and the important aspect of the bundle here is that interacting those two, we see both effects, but not any kind of greater interaction of doing both at the same time. So here I think we learned that a multi-pronged approach is valuable and necessary if we want to target these two outcomes. I think in terms of how one influences the other, that's something we can only learn from long-run studies, which we are planning to do. We are going to stay engaged in these communities and following these girls and their families and seeing how empowerment translates over the life cycle. I think my experience in working on these questions is realizing that to understand the benefits or the welfare improvements of youth employment, you really need to observe how the employment changes over the life cycle. So if we see that girls are not engaged in as many income generating activities at age 17, is that because they're in school and are going to be generating more income when they're 25? You have all of these life cycle differences that could translate into differences in employment experiences by the time a woman is 30 that I think are necessary to observe in full before we can really say what is the impact of something as complicated as an empowerment program on youth and young adult employment.
Thank you, Erika. Andrea, Erika mentioned the safe spaces. Can we talk a little bit, unpack a little bit, what is the impact of the safe spaces from your own experience?
Thank you. In our experience at Population Council, safe spaces are the preferred platform from which to deliver interventions for girls. And the use of the word space is very deliberate, so recognizing that girls are vulnerable and that vulnerability or that perceived vulnerability has an influence on their mobility and what they can already get within their community with traditional resources available to them. The Safe Spaces programming, we think, works on multiple levels. So at the girl level, there's bringing girls together in a space where they can be together and receive sort of the tailored content we've developed. But then also there's a social capital piece of what happens when you bring girls together, girls who are maybe disaggregated by marital status or age, regularly to interact with one another. Then there's the mentoring piece, which we think is really key. So having a role model, a mentor who's a little bit older, more experienced from the community ideally, but not so far away from girls that they can't sort of see themselves in her as an alternative pathway to early childbearing and marriage. And then there's also when she put on the slide about dosage, we're still trying to answer that question. How long do these programs need to be? How many times do girls have to meet? But we're thinking that it's part of this membership of coming together regularly that's crucial. Then there's also on the community or parent level, raising the visibility of girls. So saying girls need a safe space. You need to carve out this place in the community that's girls only, that's protected. That raises the visibility of girls. That says to the community, girls are a really important part of your community. And then for parents, we think there's potentially change in how they view their girls and their own aspirations for what their daughters can achieve. Now, as Erika said, I feel like there's a future research project here together, but we haven't empirically tested this safe spaces piece. So Munshi brought this up as well. We can't airdrop these interventions. So we've been using a safe spaces platform partly because if you do an in-school platform, you miss girls who are out of school. We think to reach the most vulnerable, marginalized girls, you need to do something like a safe spaces platform. But in Balika, each of the arms were successful and each had a community mobilization piece and a safe spaces piece. So is safe spaces itself the intervention? That's a question we really want to try to answer going forward, and I think that's a really important question for the field.
Thank you, Andrea. And I think it might be useful to discuss a little bit later that optimal duration, because that's something that when we want to translate evidence into action and when we want to influence that policy decision, those policy decisions, that understanding how duration impacts the equation will be very important. But let me pass to Donella. So we have had a lot of experience learning from ILA, particularly from Uganda. No? In our previous life, Sylvia and I worked with Munshi in the impact evaluation in Uganda, and a lot of different good evidence was coming up. Let us talk a little bit more about those other contexts that Munshi mentioned, no? Like how, what was specific about Uganda, and maybe what happened in those other contexts that made the design that has been proven not implementation proof, as Munshi mentioned.
Sure, thanks so much. Thanks for the great question. It's wonderful to be here on this stage with all these other amazing organizations. Thanks so much. I'll talk just a little bit more about the program fondly known as ELA, Empowerment and Livelihoods for Adolescents. I think the first thing that's important to know about it is that it grew out of a program in Bangladesh that was started in 1993 and had been running for many, many years called the Adolescent Development Program, which was all about social empowerment of girls. There was not an economic, not a skills, not an employment aspect to it. And that program had been very successful in helping girls who were out of school to maintain their literacy and all the other skills that they learned in school, even though they were not able to continue school. And then at the same time, BRAC saw all these wonderful advantages that the women's groups were having in the microfinance areas. So, and they said, gee, if this could work so successfully for women microfinance groups, perhaps this could really help the adolescent girls transition into some sort of either self-employment or employment. And so the model for ELA was developed and then piloted and launched in Uganda. And it had just remarkable results. I'll quote a couple of the statistics. There was a 48% increase in likelihood to engage in income-generating activities, which is huge, a 34% reduction in teenage pregnancy, a 62% decrease in early marriage or cohabitation, and about a third decline in girls reporting sex against their will. So it had some really powerful impacts for the girls in Uganda. So, of course, given the success, BRAC decided that we should be implementing this also now in Bangladesh. So launched a similar program alongside the ADP program, the Adolescent Development Program, but separate. And basically taking the same exact model that had these wonderful results in Uganda to Bangladesh. And lo and behold, it failed. And this was kind of a big surprise because, of course, this was Bangladesh. This was our home. This was our backyard. So one wouldn't think that we would miss certain factors that were actually culturally relevant in Bangladesh that weren't necessarily in Uganda. So in trying to really piece apart why it succeeded in one context and not in the other, we worked with a visiting scholar at Stanford University, Christian Stelos, who has a framework called The Face of Poverty. And it takes two different, it's more complicated than this, but there's basically technical barriers and relational barriers. And we, by going through that and really pulling it apart, we realized that the relational barriers to girls in Bangladesh were much, much greater than they were in Uganda. In Uganda, there's a much higher level of girls being employed and of having their own small businesses. So when they were offered some loans to start a business, they could actually be successful with it. Whereas in Bangladesh, the girls did not have much power in the girls and women don't have much power in the household, and so there just weren't those opportunities. So we take away a couple of lessons from this. One is to really address the root cause of the problem, not just the symptoms. It's often, and oftentimes the technical challenges are easier to spot, and the relational challenges and the norms are much harder to understand. The second is that not all barriers are equal. Both in Uganda and in Bangladesh, girls face similar challenges. They faced challenges that were, both economic and both normative, but the balance was much greater to the normative in Bangladesh, and that was one of the pieces that we really didn't understand. So recognizing those from the start, and then also just designing programs that can really evolve, and so as we learn these things then can evolve into something else. So the good news is that in Bangladesh, with this learning, then new programs were launched that really directed at the gender challenges much more directly, and took advantage of an existing apprenticeship program in Bangladesh, so that we now have a program that helps young girls advance into jobs and careers that's very, very separate from the social empowerment program. So those are our learnings.
Thank you so much, Donella. So Chris kindly pick 3 of your questions, so we will quickly address a couple of them. So let me start with the first one, and I'll leave you guys a chance to decide who wants to start responding. So the question is, what are the key factors to ensure interventions are sustained by the community after a long period, let's say 10 years? Anyone?
Sure. There are 2 elements of sustainability. One is the impacts, but this question is about the interventions. Yeah. If it is about the impact, the Kishori Kanta study is already looking at the impact of 9 years, 15 years, and life cycle. And this empowerment component seems to have really long-term impacts, even though it didn't change the early marriage rates, right? Now, in terms of intervention, to continue it for decades, and I have sort of different thoughts. First of all, do we need to do it in a given community for 10 years? My hunch is probably not. Because, if I look at the ILA and the way it sort of evolved, there is a bit of dying down of interest after a while. And you can do only so much to keep it going. So if you have large enough scale, you can do debate competition, inter-club competition, netball competition, this and that. That keeps some interest going on. But you can only do so much. And also, if we have limited resources, we're not going to go into every little village that we can. So it's better to sort of move on to the next one. Having said that, there could be sort of different phasing out approaches. We have CBOs, community-based organizations, and SACCOs everywhere in Africa. And these are already, these are homegrown. Can we provide enough support so that these sustain as CBOs? Possibly we can. And even if, even 20% sort of continue, that's probably good enough. That's my answer.
Thank you, Munshi. Okay. So let me move to the other experiences from the different programs. And this question is about what are the necessary conditions to determine when a pilot should be handed over to the government for scalability, I imagine. Yeah.
There are very different kinds of pilots, and so the level of rigor of the evidence from the pilot would certainly be a factor that I would take heavily into account. That is, I think before going nationwide, a pilot should be large enough to have some degree of statistical rigor in terms of saying that we know that it works. I think, usually, unless you're considering kind of a full-scale intervention in a smaller area, a pilot, that we use that word in different ways, I would go from what I normally consider a pilot, which is very small, kind of proof of concept, to a larger program that's not at scale yet by a government to iron out the kinks and figure out, there's still going to be questions of scalability and generalizability and ability of a government to make a program work. Those practical questions, I first would want to see a program at scale, personally, run with in a more heavy-handed way to kind of observe whether or not, kind of what's the upper bound in terms of doing a large program, and how do we best make it work before handing over the reins and saying, I think this is possible to do for a government to sustain, for a government to do without the interest of the NGO that designed the program or the researchers that are studying whether it works. So in general, I think it's wise to scale things up bit by bit, as opposed to going from just one pilot that works here that then has to be scaled and generalized to many different areas.
Sounds good. Thank you, Erica. Yes, please, Anna.
I would just add that before thinking about scale, we really have to answer the cost question of how much these programs cost, and then if we can sort of figure out the light version or which are the essential components, and then you can't scale up at the scale some of these pilots implement because they're really expensive at times. But if we can figure out, as a community, sort of, we can do better with costing out these interventions and figure out how to get sort of prices down so that you can go to scale.
Yes, Donella, would you like to add something there? No, we're good? Okay, so you will have time over the break to ask the remaining questions to this amazing panel. And I thank you all for your attention, and thank you the panelists for their insights and experience. And we finish for now and break for coffee.
Thank you again to our